Appendix A. Bertrand Russell cracks the complexity code, or how Bertrand Russell's explanation of the Hegelian demand to understand particulars exclusively in the context of the whole exposes the imposed incoherence of complexity theory in the national security analytical workspace. As part of his 1946 History of Western Philosophy and its connection with political and social circumstances from the earliest times to the present day, Bertrand Russell wrote the section, The Philosophy of Hegel. Russell was skeptical of Hegel, because Hegel believed that the movement forward in history entails that particular moments are but partial, imperfect manifestations of the whole, where the whole does not fully manifest as absolute act until the end times. Each partial truth is only to be understood in terms of the whole, that as yet remains continuously becoming. Underlying this construct is the idea that the particulars cannot be fully understood until they are understood as part of the whole, which, as noted, has yet to fully manifest. As Russell pointed out, the problem is that if knowledge were knowledge of the universe as a whole, there would be no knowledge at all. Moreover, it would be a practical impossibility to acquire knowledge. This is relevant to the scientized notions of complexity theory that established themselves as the controlling metaphysic within the national security analytical architecture. The archetype form of these complexity theories is the Hegelian notion of the whole, as Russell explained it. As such, quote unquote, it's complicated, exists to create the Gnostic illusion of a kept knowledge in circumstances where no knowledge actually exists. In the national security analytical workspace, analyses that become subordinated to complexity theory regimes likewise only generate pseudo-real illusions of knowledge that actually deprives decision-makers of critical information. Yet, just as Russell explained the practical impossibility of acquiring knowledge based on Hegel's construct, so too is it impossible to acquire knowledge from complexity models. As such, imposed complexity regimes have the same effect as hostile strategic-level information campaigns. Perhaps one reason national security products are brought under the control of complexity theory advocates is to keep questions from being answered in factually dispositive manners that then expose and/or violate policies that preference the enforcement of a metaphysic over tangible national security concerns. This is not the first time the debilitating nature of complexity theory has been raised. For example, the introduction to the July 2010 report, The Killing Without Right, Islamic Concepts of Terrorism, pointedly identified the debilitating role of, quote-unquote, complexity on counterterror efforts. In 2015, the book, Catastrophic Failure, Blindfolding America in the Face of Jihad, directly addressed the debilitating danger complexity theory poses to our national security. What follows is Russell's explanation of why Hegelian notions of the whole are defective, followed by Catastrophic Failure's treatment, addressing the issue from a war on terror perspective. In lining up the two documents, it will be shown that scientized notions of complexity theory are patterned after Hegel's dialectically determined concept of the whole, and that it has, in fact, resulted in the collapse of fact-based national security analysis. As such, complexity theory, as an imposed metaphysic, should be understood as an information campaign that has successfully crippled America's national security analytical efforts. From Bertrand Russell's 1946 History of Western Philosophy comes his explanation of the Hegelian demand to know particulars from the whole. Russell, quote, "The question at issue is much wider than the truth or falsehood of Hegel's philosophy. It is the question that divides the friends of analysis from its enemies. Let us take an illustration. Suppose I say, John is the father of James. Hegel, and all who believe in what Marshall Smuts calls holism, will say, before you can understand this statement, you must know who John and James are. Now, to know who John is to know all his characteristics, for apart from them, he would not be distinguishable from anyone else. But all his characteristics involve other people or things. He is characterized by his relations to his parents, his wife, and his children, by whether he is a good or a bad citizen, and by the country to which he belongs. All these things you must know before you can be said to know whom the word John refers to. Step by step, in your endeavor to say what you mean by the word John, you will be led to take account of the whole universe, and your original statement will turn out to be telling you something about the universe, not about two separate people, John and James. Now, this is all very well, but it is open to an initial objection. If the above argument were sound, how could knowledge ever begin? I know numbers of propositions of the form A is the father of B, but I do not know the whole universe. If all knowledge were knowledge of the universe as a whole, there would be no knowledge. This is enough to make us suspect a mistake somewhere. The fact is that, in order to use the word John correctly and intelligently, I do not need to know all about John, but only enough to recognize him. No doubt he has relations, near or remote, to everything in the universe, but he can't be spoken of truly without taking them into account, except such as are the direct subject matter of what is being said. He may be the father of Jemima as well as of James, but it is not necessary for me to know this in order to know that he is the father of James. If Hegel were right, we would not state fully what is meant by John is the father of James without mentioning Jemima. We ought to say John, the father of Jemima, is the father of James. This would still be inadequate. We should have to go on to mention his parents and grandparents and a whole who's who. But this lands us in absurdities. The Hegelian position might be stated as follows. The word John means all that is true of John. But as a definition, this is circular, since the word John occurs in the defining phrase. In fact, if Hegel were right, no word could begin to have a meaning, since we should need to know already the meanings of all other words in order to state all the properties of what the word designates, which, according to the theory, are what the word means." Unquote. Anticipating the current discussion on Hegel by more than 3 years, what follows is an explanation of the effects that enforcement of complexity theory regimes have wreaked on the analytical processes in support of the counterterror effort, placing the catastrophic failure analysis immediately after Russell's explanation of the archetype form. The parallels are obvious. From the discussion of complexity in Chapter 8, Our Ignorance of Catastrophic Failure. Complexity. The typical analyst and decision-maker in the War on Terror has been encouraged to construct abstract models to define the enemy. Invariably, these models are so dense and impermeable that they don't let relevant, real-world information through. Many of these abstractions arise out of a bureaucratized exegesis of complexity theory, a scientific concept that, when repurposed to serve bureaucratic narratives, is best summed up by the talking point that, quote, "The world is so complex, we really can't know anything. All we can do is manage the chaos," unquote. In this construct, the only acceptable answer to questions designed to garner a simple understanding of uncomplicated doctrines is that they are complicated. It's complicated has become an officially approved alibi for those who are supposed to be beholden to a professional duty to know. The popularity of complexity theory and bureaucratic decision-making is a signal that something has gone wrong with our national security analytical processes. This complexity is not inherent in the nature of the thing itself, in this case, the enemy's threat doctrine, but rather is imposed on it by the requirements of the relevant pseudo-scientific model. When such models are imposed on intelligence analysts who are supposed to be undertaking threat analysis, it precludes them from accounting for what they plainly see by rendering the plainly obvious too complicated to comprehend. An indication of our addiction to soft science models is the frequency by which they are adopted, embraced, and, ultimately, discarded in favor of a newer, pseudo-academic trend. If we tire of seeing the war on terror through the lens of the anthropological model expressed in terms of the human terrain, for example, we take up the psychological model and discuss leaderless jihad or the self-radicalization process. Decision-making in the pseudo-reality is not about being right, it's about conforming to the model and replacing factual analysis with requirements that conform to narratives, and then weighing the selection criteria for promotion in favor of those willing to enforce narratives over those who analyze facts. The Muslim Brotherhood spotted this vulnerability as far back as 1994, when Ibrahim Ghanem, in The West in the Eyes of the Egyptian Islamic Movement, observed, quote, "The prevailing conception of writers and researchers about the Islamic movement's view of the West and its general perception of it is one that tends to be reductionist, partial, and deformed. This comes from the consolidation of preconceptions and subjective impressions that are being given a scientific coloring." Unquote. They've had our number for some time, in all probability. So too have the Russians, Chinese, and Iranians. When I briefed at the more senior war colleges, the topic of quote-unquote complexity would often come up in conjunction with the debilitating effects such postmodern rhetoric plays on the decision-making process. I would often hear statements like, quote, "Because there are no facts, there is no truth. Everything is just interpretation," unquote. When I explained the dependence on soft science models and their self-defeating complexity, I always received silent nods of suppressed recognition, frustration, and anger. I was speaking to something real in the minds of most of the officers in those classes. In one instance, an Army colonel told me his last war college exercise was based on a complexity model. It was taken for granted that this way of thinking represented the wave of the future. He expressed his comments in terms that made it clear he was not sure he wanted to be a part of that future. Clearly, the ability to conform to postmodern narratives was understood to serve as a discriminator in future career progression. Over time, this discussion began to surface regularly in the course of my briefings. Books began to show up on my desk concerning various aspects of complexity. Colleagues and students began anonymously sending me examples of this trend, all originating from the same Defense Department Command and Control Research Program, DoD CCRP. For example, I received the following books: Coping with Bounds, Speculation on Nonlinearity in Military Affairs, Complexity Theory and Network-Centric Warfare, Complexity, Networking, and Effects-Based Approaches to Operations, Planning, Complex Endeavor. Needless to say, it is difficult to picture Caesar, Grant, Lee, Patton, Puller, or Eisenhower ever reading or feeling the need to read such books when planning actual strategy for real war. Reflecting what seems to be the CCRP motto, the two latter imprints in the listed titles carried the slogan, "The Future of Command and Control." In Coping with Bounds, Speculation and Nonlinearity in Military Affairs, author Tom Zerwinski opened with a quote from Heinz Pagels, the famous chaos philosopher who was emulated in the movie Jurassic Park. Quote, "I am convinced that the nations and people who master the new sciences of complexity will become the economic, cultural, and political superpowers of the next century," unquote, Heinz Pagels. In the 20th century, politics and policy were unduly influenced by a blind faith in quote-unquote science put in the service of Hegel's March of History. Today, those who do not accept quote-unquote complexity in bureaucratic decision-making a complexity designed to render otherwise knowable events unknowable, are likewise considered out of step with that history. The same mindset that aped the bona fide theory of evolution to propagate various social Darwinist programs now drives bureau academic ideations of complexity. Today, complexity is used as an ideological tool to immobilize what could otherwise be coherent analysis in support of planning and decision-making. The science of the one should never be confused with the politics of the other. In his monograph, Complexity Theory and Network-Centric Warfare, James Moffat made it clear that use of the term complexity theory is neither scientific nor coherent. Notes to the reader: although I use the term complexity theory as if it were a coherent body of scientific theory, this area of research is in fact still both young and evolving. Moffat laid out the complexity problem in his foreword. Appendix note: observe how Moffat's explanation parallels Russell's archetype form explanation of the whole. Quote, for the last couple of decades, attempts have been made to develop some general understanding and ultimately a theory of systems that consist of many interacting components and many hierarchical layers. It is common to call these systems complex because it is impossible to reduce the overall behavior of the system to a set of properties characterizing the individual components. Interaction is able to produce properties at the collective level that are simply not present when the components are considered individually. As an example, one may think of mutuality and collaboration in ecology. The function of any ecosystem depends crucially on mutual benefits between the different species present. One example is the relation between legumes, such as peas and beans, and their associated nitrogen-fixing bacteria. The bacteria collects nitrogen for the legume, which in turn produces carbohydrates and other organic material for the bacteria. Clearly, this crucial arrangement cannot be studied by focusing on, say, the legume and neglecting the bacteria. The ecological function emerges first when the different components are brought together and interaction is taken into account. Unquote. Applied to threat analysis, as complexity asserts the impossibility of reducing, quote, the overall behavior of the system to a set of properties characterizing the individual components to a discrete knowable thing, unquote, it makes it impossible to analyze the enemy's published doctrine. It's complicated. As model-based complexity thinking goes, before one can speak to the reality of jihad-based terrorism in the war on terror, one must first understand the concept of terrorism in some abstracted totality, preferably in terms of violent extremism, so that a model can be extrapolated to apply, first, to all terrorism in the abstract, and then to the form of terrorism in question. It is through such machinations that Al-Qaeda can be understood as an equivalency to returning U.S. veterans. For those who invest in this institutionalized pseudo-reality, knowing the enemy really does become complicated. In fact, it becomes impossible. Complexity becomes a key enabler of the pseudo-reality. Or is that the other way around? Moffat's foreword demonstrates the irrelevance of complexity theory in the context of decision-making as a warfighting pursuit. Think of the farmer and his legumes in Moffat's example above. At no time does the farmer have to think in terms of mutuality and collaboration in ecology, or about the relation between legumes such as peas and beans and their associated nitrogen-fixing bacteria in order to cultivate his garden. If farmers had to think this way before cultivating their gardens, they might never get around to it. In fact, very few people would be surprised if a poll revealed that 1. Most farmers don't think this way, and 2. Most people who do think this way don't farm. If farmers don't cultivate their crops, we will starve. If we wait for the complexity theorists to cultivate those crops, we will also starve, while listening to them discuss the impossibility of planting a seed until we develop a plan for planting all possible seeds, given the complexity of the ecosystem. In other words, the farmer doesn't have to solve the problems of the universe in order to plant his legumes. Rather, it is sufficient that he knows how to farm in ways that accord with sound farming practices. And here's the rub. There is neither a necessary nor sufficient reason to have to explain what happens, for example, to the flower in India when the butterfly flaps its wings in Detroit as a precondition to explaining why Al-Qaeda follows Islamic law. There is simply the institutionalized mandate that it be so, while national security decision makers may never be able to explain the complexity underlying either the butterfly in Detroit or the flower in India. The concentration on either of these two issues is a purposefully irrelevant distraction. Complexity theory demands that decision makers convince themselves through such casuistry that they lack the understanding to explain either the self-identified enemy or his self-identified doctrine. This type of organizational thinking has paralyzed analytical processes and compromised decision-making. Junior officers understand this, senior leadership does not.